So Kevin, firstly, a very warm welcome to our Quitch webinar this morning on all things gamification and the future of education. So firstly, I'm very excited about what you have to say about the future. I'm always excited to listen to what you have to say because your work up to date has been very impactful in terms of the impact it has on students and higher education. So we know you are an expert in the field. You have done your doctoral studies at the University in Pennsylvania. You've authored a book called Game On, so gamification, gameful design, and hopefully you can expand a little on that, Kevin, during the session today. And also, of course, looking at the gamer in education, so where that will take us. So I'm very much looking forward, as are all of our attendees here today, Kevin. So I'd like to welcome all of the attendees as well. So Kevin will present for approximately 20 minutes. And then we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So any questions you have for Kevin, if you'd like to pop them in the Q&A chat, and he can take those at the end. And Kevin does, in fact, love to answer questions. So don't fear that they won't get a response. So thanks, everybody, for attending. Kevin, a very warm welcome to you again. And I'm going to hand over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Grania. And hi, everyone. I, like some of you, I think, was just running from another meeting. So I've got established, sorry, my light's not very great here, but I'll switch to some slides so you don't have to focus on the glare behind me at the minute. I'm based in Sydney, currently with AWS. Depending on the room, I often say I'm either I've come from or gone to the dark side. So I had about 20 years in higher ed. I'm from the UK, but I spent my early career in the US at a number of institutions and culminated with my doctorate at Penn, and then relocated down under, as we say, around 2016 as Western Sydney University's Pro-Vice Chancellor at Digital Futures. So we did quite a lot of interesting work at Western, but I wrapped that up at the end of 19 and started at AWS not long after that as their head of higher ed and research. So now I get to work with 40 or so institutions, not just one, which is super interesting and exciting. I've come across people like Grania, who's got a background at one of our institutions, one of our university partners, and get to look at really interesting partners and customers and bring them together. Sort of listening for challenges. And one of the biggest challenges that I think all of us here at the minute, post-COVID, new world, Generation Alpha, is engagement, student experience. And when we get to conversation, we'll talk, I think, a little more about Quitch and some of the work Grania's done there. But I do want to tie it back to some of my research that I did a number of years ago, and how, despite the fact I thought I was getting long in the tooth and irrelevant, how it seems to have looped around and become bizarrely somewhat relevant again. So I will share some slides, and as Grania said, it'll be a little 15-20 minute whistle stop tour. But I wanted to kick it off just with a kind of fun post, really. This was an article that I collaborated with EDUCAUSE on a few years ago, and I'm certainly happy to send that. I've got it in PDF and can send a link to it. It really summarizes the work that I did around my dissertation, my doctoral studies, that then got sort of segued when a publisher stopped by my research display into a book that was published end of 2017, 2018, so a while ago. The picture that I put up was also just kind of for fun. I'm sure you can recognize my co-presenter there. That was at South by Southwest EDU a number of years ago, and it's sort of relevant because Jill, as I call her, Dr. Biden at the time, was the wife of the vice president. And a bit like my book, you know, we thought she was done and finished, and then she came back as wife of the president. So I'm sort of, aligning my life story with Jill and Joe's life story, eventually coming back into vogue before they get too old and get shuffled out of office. But Jill, as you know, Biden's wife Jill was and is a high school teacher, and is great company, great person, fun to be with. So that was a while ago. That was my former life, and as I say, some of it's come around, as has she and Joe, to be somewhat more relevant again going forward. Just trying to advance my slides, and for some reason struggling with that. Give me a second. Okay, so I alluded to this a little earlier, but we've done quite a lot of work. The PR staff at Amazon Web Services, where I work, asked me if I would produce an ebook a while ago, and I said, well, look, I could, but you don't want to listen to me bang on. So what I did was interviewed a lot of DVCs, PVCs, former friends, etc. It was before Grania and I had really connected, so I would have interviewed her, I think. But I talked to a couple of tech vendors and got a lot of of quotes and experience. And this was one theme that came up a lot. You know, our students have changed, our institutions haven't adapted sufficiently to this reality. We had the reality of COVID, and that obviously fast forwarded a lot of people to use tools like Zoom and Teams, etc., that they hadn't used before. But we didn't really fundamentally shift the institutions, and a lot have sort of snapped back with some legacy work, but sort of snapped back to business as usual. And I think the students who, because of COVID, because of the life that we had at the time, tolerated what I'll call sort of suboptimal or difficult online and hybrid experiences, are not going to tolerate that for long. You know, we're already seeing that a lot of students, this has manifested itself stateside in particular. A lot of students who were engaging with institutions and did online at the institution during COVID, because, you know, everyone was toughing it out. If they're going to do online now, they're probably going to go to an online provider that's got 10, 15, 20 years experience. And the big providers like Southern New Hampshire University, where I used to work, are seeing their numbers go up, because students are thinking, oh, if I've got to do something online, I may as well do it with someone who does online well, as opposed to someone who just throws up an hour recording of a lecture that is really difficult to watch. So students are kind of voting with their feet, and I think we'll see more of this. Students have got a lot more choice. The globe is in many ways more open. If you're going to do online, you could do online with an American or a UK provider. So if we don't do those online blended hybrid experiences well, you know, we're gonna struggle in the sector, I think. And you know, we're not competing even just with universities and other institutions anymore. We're competing with social media experiences. We're competing with student preference and a real focus on personalized learning around you know, sort of tailored experiences that work for me. One of our customers at Amazon is Netflix, and that's a very common metaphor that's used, right? If students have that experience where, you know, you watch this show and people who like this show and tend to watch this show, and you get that recommendation engine that eventually tailors. At home, I have the 5 profiles. If I by mistake get onto my son's or my daughter's, I'm sent all these recommendations that don't work for me. I go to my profile with a cool kind of little picture on the top of it, and it's my world and it's my stuff, and there's far too many documentaries and sporty things that my wife and kids wouldn't watch. But it's tailored to me, so I feel at home in my tailored Netflix. I want to feel at home in my tailored academic experience, academic environment, with tools and systems that have sort of adapted to speak to the things that drive me, the motivators, if you like. And I want to just touch this before we go. I think it's incumbent on us to really think about the human side of these. As we talk a lot about, you know, automating or adding technology, I've got, what, 5 minutes in and I haven't mentioned Gen AI yet. That's quite an achievement. But, you know, there's so much out there around this question of the machine versus the people. I just want to drop this reference because probably one of my favorite authors, certainly in nonfiction, is Neil Postman, who passed away a few years ago, but his work is so relevant. I just screenshotted some of his main texts there. I mean, just the titles to me are just like brilliant. Teaching as a Subversive Activity, Technopoly. But he was the first one to sort of identify, which I think, you know, if this is not still relevant, then I'm misinterpreting things. But particularly in the US, but I think globally, when everyone was looking ahead to 1984 and thinking George Orwell, it's all going to be restricted information and they are going to control what we see and control what we hear. And everyone, as Postman said, was afraid of this Orwellian future. And what actually happened was we got more towards Aldous Huxley's Brave New World future, which was no one needs to conceal the truth because the truth is drowned in a sea of irrelevance. That's a Postman quote, right? And to me, that translates pretty much literally to cat videos and absolute nonsense on social media. And we can't find the truth because the algorithms are sending us stuff that we want to see, even if what we want to see is, is crap, right? So that notion that we've got to think about the competitive advantage of people. How do we train and educate students so that they, A, stay engaged enough, and B, learn how to navigate this world, which, you know, has hallucinations, has this sea of irrelevance, to use Postman's quote. And I think it's incumbent on us, on educators, to really focus on that and really accentuate the human, which I think we can do with this world of sort of intrinsic motivators and gameful design. I'll throw you a couple of current examples that I'm in love with at the minute. Customers of ours, one a former employer of mine, and actually, I guess technically both employers, because I'm currently adjunct faculty at UNSW, but they've both been doing, UNSW and Western Sydney University have both been doing solar car projects. And to live with this team for a little while and spend some time with them, you will just be blown away. It's absolutely phenomenal. The Western project's a bit lower budget, a bit cheap and cheerful, and they're in a slightly different category. But the quote on the top right, which I won't read, is just some of the student quotes and some of the data around how many hours the students are putting in. And if you get this right, generally, what I'm seeing is you don't have to worry about, have students done enough hours to be academically rigorous? It's getting them to stop that's the problem. So that Western Sydney quote, around the 30,000 hours, the SunSwift solar project. I don't know if you noticed that, but that was one of the cleverest bits of branding. SunSwift has UNSW in the middle. Grania, had you seen that before? It's like one of those things now I can't unsee it, but they have the head of the former head of Red Bull F1 who's working with the project, and they set all of the sensors, etc., on the car. You can read the information there, but they collaborated with us at AWS basically, so that their car, as it's running, has all these sensors firing 1,000 data points per second up to the cloud, down from the cloud. We can tweak this, the tire pressure's low, whatever. And, getting thousands and thousands of kilometers on no sort of energy, basically. And the SunSwift UNSW project won the global title for that. The challenge, here's the only flaw with this: both had about 100 students involved. These are 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 student institutions. If you can only have 100 students involved, that's great. God, I wish we could scale it. So that becomes the fundamental problem. Like, how do we scale this kind of experience? And think a little bit before we proceed as to why it is so engaging, right? The authenticity, absolutely. This is a real world project. This is effectively potentially saving the planet, right? There's your narrative if you need one. If we don't get off fossil fuels, if we don't whatever, I'm not going political at this point, but clearly there's a massive narrative there. Let's develop a car that's the future of automobile and transportation. The collaboration, right? I've never seen a student group as tight, particularly the UNSW group, but also the Western Sydney, right? And these are students from different disciplines. There's the geeky engineering techies, but there's also marketing students looking at marketing at this, PR around it. There's the whole logistics. There's the physiology, psychology of the drivers. So, I mean, right there, I've quickly outlined 5 or 6 interdisciplinary elements, and they're working together as if their lives depended on it. So there's something there. I mentioned sort of authenticity, cooperation, collaboration, and then what about competition, right? They both were entered in national/global competitions. The UNSW won their category. Western Sydney were, I think, top 3. And Western Sydney's not a high prestige university, right? And they're suddenly competing against institutions with 10 times the money, 10 times the funding, and they're this scrappy little team that succeeds. So think of yourselves and your academic or social experiences, other things that you do where you're just like, I'm so into this, right? I'm so in the moment that time is flying, and I don't even look at my watch anymore. We've been 10 hours here today, and it feels like 10 minutes. I find that often the academic experience is the complete opposite of that, where we go, oh, how long have I been doing this for? Have I been reading this PDF for 3 hours? Oh, it's only been 20 minutes, right? So we're going for the former, not the latter. We're going for this place where things are so focused and time seems to speed up. And the godfather in this area is this fella whose name is lovely to pronounce. I want to test Grammy on it. I'll have a stab. So Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is how I understand, Ukrainian, based in the US. And he was one of the first people who sort of pulled all these elements together. And he's got, there's a quote generator. You can look up, if you can remember or capture his name, look in the quote generator and just stuff pops up. And it's all around, with a couple of tweaks, an experience that's a bit dreary can suddenly become kind of cool, right? So here's this one here I thought was quite cool. Goals transform a random walk into a chase. A practitioner who I'd worked with at one point had said, he was from the UK, like me, so into proper football, I'll say it for the Australians, or soccer if you insist. And he'd said, tell kids they've got to run around and exercise and get healthy, and they'll be absolutely bored to death within 5 minutes. Give them a ball and put down 2 sweaters as goalposts, 2 jumpers as goalposts. They'll play football for like an hour and a half in the UK anyway, where they're into this. Or it could be translated into AFL, et cetera, I guess, if you insist. But the point being, a couple of markers and a ball, and suddenly it becomes a sport. Running around and exercise becomes a sport. A few goals, if you say, okay, this is now a walk, but it's kind of a speed walk, and you're competing against your watch to see if you can beat what you did last week, or you want to see if you can do an hour without a break, or you want to see if whatever. Any sort of goals, even if slightly contrived, can suddenly turn a bit of a mundane thing into something that's kind of engaging. And if you've got these goals or rules or restrictions, sometimes time limit, can you finish the walk within 2 hours? It suddenly becomes more likely to generate what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, that notion of time speeding up and you actually kind of enjoy in the process. I'm not a runner. I was a football player, still arguably am, but I never liked running. I only ever ran to train to get fit for soccer. However, one year I did have a go for it and decided I was going to do a couple of half marathons. And I did my hometown run, which is called the Great North Run in Newcastle. It's one of the first half marathons, big one, 30, 40,000 people. And I ran it and didn't put headphones on and just listened to the crowd and listened to the participants and passed all the sites. And my dad had run it a few times, so I was kind of thinking of him as I'm running it. And I remember passing like the 6 mile mark and thinking, oh, okay. And then I saw another mile marker coming up. And I'm like, okay, this will be 7. And it was 8. And I'm like, I just had like 2 miles of running without feeling pain. And it had never happened before. And it's the one time I've since lapsed and couldn't run a mile now. But I've since sort of reflected on that and thought I actually got motivated and got committed and had enough intrinsic motivators that something that was traditionally kind of painful for me actually flowed completely. So if you're ever passing that 6 mile mark and you hit another one and it's 8 or 9 and you suddenly think, wow, that's again kind of what we're hoping for we can do with some of these new experiences. So I'll take you on a quick journey back to a couple of the case studies that I came across when I was pulling all this. I was basically pulling my theory together around intrinsic motivators that could keep students engaged, particularly in online classes, because I'd done a lot of work in online education, and I was worried that it was being viewed as a sort of second-class offering for poor people. It was, if you can't afford to go to Harvard or Stanford, do this online degree, but it's a bit crappy and it could be. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. I think for certain people, for certain life conditions, online might be the only option. It might be a preferred option. So let's see if we can make it as good as we can possibly do it. So I've been pulling this theory together and then started to meet. I got out and about and started to meet some practitioners. Neil came to me from a recommendation from a colleague that I worked with when I was at Northeastern University. And she said, you should talk to this guy, Neil. He does a lot of stuff with that kind of thing. So I went up to meet him. He's at University of New Hampshire. And he was teaching a microeconomics class. The students were taking it as part of their general ed requirement, which meant a lot of students who weren't really in economics and maths were doing his economics course. So a lot of them were there under protest, didn't like it, didn't want to do it. Show me what to do. I'm done, not engaging. A lot of them dropped out, didn't finish, et cetera, et cetera. So Neil sort of reflected on this a lot and thought, well, I don't know, I'll do some cool metaphor-y stuff and I'll tell them how it relates to things in life. So he does what all we middle-aged white guys do. We related it to our own experiences and said, oh, it's a bit like Star Trek or Doctor Who or what. And the students are kind of looking at him going, don't know what you mean, Granddad. So he decided that narrative was still important, but his wife was really sort of into social media. She was into something like knitting, I'm going to say, but she had communities and they told each other stories. So he decided stories are the thing. And what he did was delegated the narrative to the students and said, look, here are the principles of economics, microeconomics. Tell me a story in which these principles feature. And he just opened it up. And the students started to come back with stories. One was the grandparent of Russian immigrants. So she started talking about scarcity and the economic situation in Russia that forced her grandparents to come across to the US. I was in the US at the time. And, and build a new life there. So that journey from difficult economics to better economics. Another student talked about, at the time it was Matt Damon's movie, The Martian, was popular. So he talked about people who, because of scarcity and economic circumstances on Earth, might be forced to go and live on another planet like Mars. So 2 very different stories. Because in 1900, immigrants coming from Russia, 2050, let's say, people going to Mars. So completely different stories. Neil didn't give a crap as to what the story was. He said, tell each other the stories. So then students start to learn from each other and think, I'll remember that concept because that was like your grandparent from Russia. So the mnemonic value of the narrative becomes that it reinforces some of the learning. And what Neil and I realized, and I was pulling my research together, was we could break down these motivators into categories. And what I did for my sins was sort of go through all the literature, so you don't have to, and sort of pulled all of these motivators, looked for where people were basically saying the same thing. So Csikszentmihalyi, Carl Kapp, K-A-P-P, is one of the leaders in this. Jesse Schell, who was at Carnegie Mellon, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch. But if you look for them, they become obvious commonalities. And I cheated by putting some of the C's together, that conflict, competition, cooperation, possibly sort of just call it humanity or whatever. But these sort of categories, and unfortunately there's 11, which is a terrible number to work with. I wish there were 10. But I found 11, and that first one sort of relates back to the turn the walk into a chase. If there are some clear rules, right? You think of a game like golf, there are rules. You can't kick the ball, which as a football player, I sort of regret and resent. But, there's rules, what you can do, what you can't do. It's pretty easy to pick up and play. You don't need to read a manual for 5 hours. This one, I think, next one is very key, the appropriate level of challenge. If it's too easy or too hard, then people get demotivated. Allegedly, apparently, per the research, the key level is when you look at something and think, I've got a 50-50 chance of this, right? So if you're looking at a problem, if you do the Sudoku or you do the crossword, or you do Wordle or whatever, if you look at it and think, there's a good chance I'll fail, but there's a pretty good chance I'll succeed. So right in that 50-50 is the Goldilocks spot. They're just right, not too hot, not too cold. That's the appropriate level of challenge. So I'll not go through them all here because we'll sort of maybe discuss this a bit later on, which ones catch your eye. But the point being, they don't all have to. I developed this sort of thumbs up thing because I actually taught a few classes in this subject where the participants eventually gamified or intrinsically motivated their class activity by focusing on certain elements. So in this example, the appropriate level of challenge was a signature element. We managed to sort of navigate, this is not Neil Nyman's, it's just a sample, but we managed to navigate so that every student felt appropriately challenged, however easy or however hard. I would say that's one that with Gen AI is coming back round, right? Because if you've got your class notes, your content, and you're pitching for what you think's the middle, you could actually throw that through a generative AI tool. Other vendors are available, and ask it to produce one that uses only simple language. So please produce a version of this content that only uses simple language that whatever, I was going to say primary school, but maybe that's too low. Maybe say a 15-year-old competent student could follow, or a non-native speaker might follow. So strips out all of the metaphor, all of the narrative, all of the idiosyncrasies, all of the language quirks, and produces just simple plain English. So there's a plain English version, then there's your version, then you could produce a more complex version. So there are ways that in 20 minutes you could produce 3 or 4 or 5 versions of your content that make it slightly easier or slightly more difficult. So maybe that could be a signature element for you. So as I say, we'll revisit some of these. Don't get freaked by any of them. And I was talking with Grania a little bit beforehand. The key thing is you don't have to do them all, right? Pick 3, pick 4. Decide which ones you think, yeah, try and do that. Could I maybe use some newer technology or newer systems to make it happen even more? And my goal with the class was to have people self-assess with the thumbs and then see if we could push the thumbs a little further to the right, or at least some of them. And it worked pretty well. This is one other quick example. A guy called Fred Abley, who was and still is an instructor at Penn State University. I went to University Penn State, slightly different, but same town, obviously, Philadelphia. Fred was a former security guy. He worked in Homeland Security, and this course that he taught at Penn was about that. And he came in as an external, having been in real world, and was given a textbook and Canvas LMS. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but told, teach a traditional class. And he did it a couple of times, and he thought, yeah, I'm not loving this. I will say, the sense of fun in a lot of the practitioners, I think, is key. And certainly, when I work with people like Grania, we have fun. And she's a very fun person. If you don't know that about her, I'll give that away. But Fred's a fun guy. And he decided he was going to do something that was a bit beyond the normal. So what he actually does in the first week of his class, he has created a terrorist incident, which he, in front of the class, ostentatiously seals inside an envelope and says, this is your challenge. You have to determine how and where and why and by whom this terrorist attack is going to happen. And through the course of this unit, this class, you will be given intel, clues, small bits of information that will allow you to determine all of these elements. It's very, very hard. He has about these 6 or 7 parameters, and I think one student group had got all 6, but usually most students get through and get 4 or 5. They maybe don't get the 5th or 6th. What he does, the little bit on the bottom there, those represent the individual national kind of homeland security organizations. So I think in Canada, it still is kind of the Mounties, and I'm not sure if it's the FBI in the US, and it's sort of Scotland Yard in the UK, but this is the Italian one, which I won't even try and read, and then the French one, Security Extérieure, and the students get allocated. So the students become the Italian Homeland Security team, the French Homeland Security team, the American. So right there, you've got a bit of sort of team competition. Are the French going to decipher the plot, or are the Italians, or are the Americans? But then you have within the team, you start to get that UNSW solar car kind of gelling. The team are all together. To advance in the unit, everyone of the team had to clear the bar, whether that was just a quick sort of quiz or it was some sort of hand-in. So the students are all like giving each other subtle peer pressure, helping each other. And the term for that, which I think I may have mentioned last time we talked, is dependent hero contingency. Which means, yeah, we're sort of dependent on each other, but we're all in a team sort of moving forward and trying to win as a team. The simplistic version of that, of course, is the Harry Potter protocol, right? So it's Gryffindor versus Slytherin versus whatever. But that notion that you're part of something bigger than just you, but you also have support from your peers and they're all encouraging each other. This one, again, this was an example where Fred was like, I had to tell these kids, these young adults, to stop working sometimes. And he was crazy with his Intel. He would put Intel sometimes in Canvas, the LMS, very basic level, or he'd throw it around campus. So the students would be walking around campus and he would give clues in Farsi, in foreign language, that the students had to decipher. They learned that there was one guy who worked in the cafeteria who was Iranian who could translate their Farsi. So, think of that. The students are sort of getting engaged. How do we do this? All of their deliverables had to be them sort of standing with a newspaper with today's date on to prove that they've got it in time. So he made it all, kind of interesting, authentic, fun, cooperation, collaboration. Again, we get to these elements. And then when the students came to sort of explain how they deciphered the plot, he had his former colleagues who are actually still working in Homeland Security, a couple of them who worked at the airport, who were very involved with security, would come in. So they're right there presenting and talking to people who, really live and breathe this stuff. So it becomes less of an academic theoretical exercise, more a sort of applied, here's what we learned about this. And he had students who went on and got employment based on this class and based on their presentations to people who are working in the field. So Fred Aebly, Aebli, he does quite a lot of sort of hands-on basic computing courses as well. He's got a web presence. So yeah, look him up if you can. Another super guy doing really good work. So that was my 2017 world. I got through my doctorate, walked with a beautiful gown that I now wear as a house robe, but my wife still doesn't call me Dr. Bell. So, I got through that experience. It was super. It was great. Fast forward now, I'm in my real world now, and I'm like, right, what can we do to leverage some of this? Because as I say, candidly, a bit like Jill Biden, I thought Jill and I were both finished. We'd run our course, but I'm seeing a lot now of things that are coming up that I'm like, that's the same principle. Right? It's cooler tech. It's not a Word document or a PowerPoint in Canvas. Again, I don't mean Canvas in a negative way. It wasn't Fred's world or even Neil's world. It isn't and doesn't have to be PowerPoint PDF anymore, although it still can be. The principles apply. And some of the stuff we're doing now, some of the stuff that some universities are doing with things like digital twins. A digital twin is a simulation that pulls from IoT, Internet of Things sensors, to provide authentic feedback. A lot of universities are starting to do this with their own campuses. So if you hear of a smart campus, what they've often got is a digital twin of the smart campus, which basically is pulling all the building information, including HVAC, including room usage, etc., heat, temperature, blah, 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 into a central environment where people can sort of look and move things around a bit matrix style. And what they try is then tested by the actual authentic connection that brings information across. So I heard of some examples, again, just before the session. I was talking with Grania around, there are so many real world environments and experiences. Think of the Baltimore Bridge being hit by a boat. There's a class activity, unfortunately. Can you build a bridge that will survive collision from an absolutely massive boat that's gone out of control? There's a class activity. There's a narrative. You don't have to make it up. It's not Star Trek or Doctor Who, but could you build a digital twin of a bridge that engineering students could work on, that you could stress test based on the actual data from a boat crashing into a bridge, or a bridge that suddenly has 10 times as much traffic? So I think there's a lot in that. If you start to look at a digital twin and then go back to my initial principles, or Csikszentmihalyi's, or Carl Capps, or Jesse Shells, or whoever else I amalgamated, you start to sort of see some of those elements, the aesthetics of it, if you like, the competition, the cooperation. Some of these elements you could absolutely think with a digital twin, if we put students into groups and had them build different versions of bridges, which bridge would be the strongest? There's collaboration, cooperation, dependent hero, Harry Potter, etc., etc. So there's current tech that I think if we use the framework, we can really make a case as to why and how it's going to be super engaging. Of course, I will mention AWS. We've done a lot of work in this space. We did a massive digital project with Emirates for training, etc. That was all sort of simulation, 3D, etc., etc. And funnily enough, when they did their promotional piece, it had "Game On" with an exclamation mark, and I said, I've seen that somewhere else, which was my book, which Granier nicely referenced at the start of this. But yeah, just the again sort of emphasizes the Jill Biden concept that nothing's old and finished. It can come back and be sort of a current thing again. So we've done a lot of work in this space, digital twin, and then the other piece, a bit of animation there. The other piece that I'm hearing a lot about practitioners of late, which again I'd theorized around, was escape rooms. Right, we're talking about younger adults who aren't engaging with activities, experiences, etc. And yet my daughter, plural, I've got 2 of them, would spend a lot of time with her friends, going and spending like 3, 4, 5 hours, really, really focused. If you've done some of the escape rooms, particularly some of the scary ones, they're very, very focused. And you have a time limit. So you've got your rules, and you've got your regulations, and you've got your pressure, and you've got your motivators, and you're cooperating with each other, and you're trying to get out in a certain time, whether it's 1 hour or 2 hours. It's very, very focused. So I talked about this theoretically, and if you see the date on this, January 23rd, 2023, it's recent, and there are a lot of sort of more recent examples that are coming up, and the students are super engaged with this. So obviously, to build a full-on escape room, again, probably out of scope for most of us on the call, but elements of it, right? So again, this article references, look at that key phrase, intermediate level of difficulty. So again, it's that 50-50. I might fail, I might not. Sometimes people talk about whitewater rafting. You want it to be difficult and challenging, and when you finish, you go, yay! Not super, super easy, super, super boring. So I think there's another couple of quotes. This article actually does a big review. It's a meta-analysis, I guess, of escape rooms for learning, and they looked at about 70 or 80. So there's evidence out there. If you want to have a look around, their core conclusion is sort of fitted in here. And look at the language it's referencing: constructivist, active, collaborative. That second paragraph starts with the need for participants to work together in a time-pressured but fun. Bang, there's 3 intrinsic motivators that just nail it, right? So again, you might not want to do the journey through the life of Star Trek and Doctor Who, but could you perhaps put some sort of time element? Could you put some fun in there? Could you put some participation in there? Are there elements that you could throw in that would make what could otherwise be a slightly mundane experience suddenly more motivating? So I've published on this. This is the book. Like I said, I'm happy to send across the EduCourse PDF that is far more readable in a short coffee break. I also contributed Michael Sankey, Henk Hughes, sort of friends and collaborators. I used to work with Michael at Western Sydney. We were both there, but they asked me to do a version of this. So if you look on the top, chapter 25 is the key chapter, obviously, in this book. But this is actually a really interesting text. It's substantial. But it has, as that shows, something like 20 or 30 chapters around different elements of tech-enabled learning and how they could be applied to a current university. As I say, chapter 25 is the one, but I'll send you a shorter version of that if you like. And just because I've gone on too long, to tie it, I think come back to that first piece, we want to emphasize and accentuate the human. And we do that with a bit of fun, a bit of competition, a bit of collaboration. And I'd not come across this until I was doing some recent revisiting of this, but this, I don't know how you pronounce Morovich's paradox. The things that are easy for a 5-year-old are the hard things for a machine. And think back to that. I love that picture of just, can you get your students in that place where they're having fun? And Grania and I will open it up, but that was what sort of attracted me to Grania and the work she's doing and playing and engaging with Quitch and learning on it. It's fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. And, it's engaging. It's clever because it's giving you chunks of information, and you can collaborate with each other around it and that sort of thing. And that 5-year-old aspect, that notion of, if you walk into a room and look at the room, you can kind of read the room in a second. A machine cannot do that. So if you're working in teams with people and your teams are competing or collaborating and they're having fun, and you walk into a SunSwift solar car environment, you know within like a second and a half how engaged they are, how much they're learning, and how much fun they're having. And that's not something we can replace with a machine. So I think, use these principles to accentuate the human, to champion the human, give the tools and some of the systems that'll help you with some of the motivators. And as I say, it's not an all or one. You don't have to go into this up to the neck. You can give it a try and dabble. And with your academic experience, it might be that you talk to Granier and do a Quitch trial and run some of it and see how it goes. And then once you get on board with that, I think the sky is sort of the limit. So I think that's my end. I will stop share. Sorry, I think I went on a bit, but I get into this stuff, as you can tell. But thanks for listening, those who've stuck around. And Grania, let's open it up.
Kevin, that was absolutely fantastic. I always love your presentations. They're always delivered with such passion. But behind the passion is a lot of years of research, and you've got the evidence to back it all up, which is fantastic. We have run over time, but I think nobody will have any problems with that. And we will record it and share it with everybody who was here today. But there was a few things I wanted to kind of, if you like, summarize. Kevin, I thought some of the key things you talked about was that intrinsic motivation, I think, is a key player in all this when we talk about gamification and education. You talk about that personalized feedback as well, another key issue. As you were saying earlier, perhaps it was to me before the session started, but it's too late for us providing feedback when people are, towards their mid-semester test or they haven't received that feedback. There's a lot of issues with that. One of the other things I like to slide around, the competitive advantage of people. That's a really interesting one, and not something I think that we talk about a lot. And then when you look at that project you did with UNSW and University of Western Sydney, and what I liked there was you talked about that experience, but it was like 100 people in each. But how do we actually scale that kind of thing? And that's I think is a challenge for us, or perhaps a challenge for AWS that they can look into and help us out as academics. And a few other key things you talked about: applied study, authenticity, and the narrative. And the narrative again and the engagement was when you talked about the UNSW and the University of Western Sydney example there. But there was a few other key things you talked about. One of the things that I hadn't really come across before was that what is the appropriate level of challenge, Kevin? And do you want to talk just a little bit more about that? Because I think it would be interesting for people to hear about that. And in this recording, you did talk a little bit about it, but do you have anything?
Look, I think, as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of research around it. And I use that metaphor quickly that maybe went past people around the whitewater rafting, right? When you have a new experience, if it's super, super difficult and you think there's no way I can do this, then, it's not motivating. I use the CrossFit examples, right? My mum, bless her, would say she's not at all competitive, and yet give her a times difficult Sudoku, the hard one, whatever you call it, or the cryptic crossword. And the Sudokus usually put a time limit, right? They'll say, not a time limit, but they'll say target time. So give my mum a devilishly hard Sudoku and a target time and watch her go. And she's and she beats it. Like she does it, she's way beyond my capacity. But for her, that's the level, right? If I'm sitting with that, I'm not good at Sudoku, right? I'll fess up. If I'm sitting with that and it's got a time limit of 30 minutes, I don't even look at it because I'm like, I know there's not a chance in hell that I can get through that in 30. So very, very difficult is demotivating. Too difficult is demotivating. I think we get a lot of that with, first in family, non-native speakers coming in.
Correct.
If you're being an erudite, wise, PhD'd instructor and you're using flowery language, as we all tend to do sometimes, you can lose people. And if you lose people in the first week or day or, particularly if it's a course like Neil's, if it's maths-based, you've got half the people there going, oh, I've always been terrible at maths. It's just a thing, right? So appropriate level of challenge for a math course is it's some easy wins. And if you look at gamified, gameful apps or experiences, they'll throw you a couple of easy ones to get you hooked. Right. And then once you get hooked, once you get further in, you can make it more difficult. And I've heard, going back to even things like Angry Birds, I used to play once, they'll give you screen 25 or level 25, which is really, really difficult. And it takes you ages to get through. But then level 26 is kind of easy. So mentally you're going, I struggle with 25, but 26 I nailed. I'm going to keep going. Right. If you made 26 even harder than 25, it would be, that was so hard. This is even harder. I'm now on a treadmill with no progression. I'm done. So the
opting
game
out.
guys know how this works, and we don't in academia, but there's enough, as you say, evidence there that we can work it out. And likewise, if it's way too easy, you're just like, what's the point of this? It's way too easy. I'm not being stretched. And as I say, I think technology's aligning because the principles are there. They've been there for a while. But now we look at things like Gen AI, and you can run through and produce versions of curriculum, and yeah, you have to edit it and watch for, hallucinations and curate a little bit. But in my former life, leading instructional design teams, going back to academics and saying, okay, that's great that you spend 20 hours producing this content. Can you produce another 20 hours of slightly different content that's a bit easier? Or, another 20 hours that's, a different way of explaining it, which is what drives adaptive learning, etc. Good luck with that, right? Please spend another 20. But hey, I've taken your content, I've run it through, and here's a version that strips out all of the complex language and uses, I forget the French author who restricted themselves to like the 5,000 most common words in the French language. You might know. We'll look it up as homework. But there was one of the French classic authors, and he said, I'm not going to exclude any of the people, any of the common people. So I'm only going to use words that are in the basic 5 to 10,000 or whatever it was of the French language. So, you could say that to Gen AI basically and say, please produce a version that, uses only English that would be understandable by a non-native speaker. I don't know if it would work as a prompt, but you try it and it takes 10 minutes.
Try it
and then try it again. So I think we've known about this level of challenge, but we've got tools and systems that actually can really help us do that now. So it's got to be worth a shot.
Yeah. No, I love it, Kevin. And Kevin, I'll just I will let you go then. The last thing that I wanted to comment on that you talked about in terms of us as academics is you had that matrix, which was great, that simple matrix. About you said there's a lot of things in there. There was 11 or something, but just try one or two. Just try something to get going and so on. Then get your feedback and move on. But I think that's an important thing that you don't have to do everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I teach this course, I'll try and say to people, think of something that you do where time goes quickly, right? And it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be a sport or a game or anything. Just think of something. And quite often people say, I like to watch a good movie. All right. So think of the elements that made that movie good. And I've done that myself, right? I'm getting to that age, right? A certain age, put me in a dark room with a comfy chair and good luck, keeping me awake. Oppenheimer, however, I stayed awake for all the time, right? Because that was just fascinating, interesting, fast-paced. So if I analyze like what's appropriate about that, for me, it was the authenticity, it was the acting, but there was certain things about that. If I think about it, I could boil it down and go, it was the appropriate level of challenge for me. There were bits of science that were somewhat difficult to understand, but I just about got it. So there was something about that movie where I stayed awake for 3 hours and boom, that was done. Then I'll go and see, I've got a son as well, a lot of Marvel stuff. By the fourth Ant-Man movie, I'm done and I'm asleep within 10 minutes. So think of something that doesn't have to be academic, doesn't have to be a sport, but think of something you do where time goes quickly and think about, are there any of these elements? I guarantee of those 11, there'll be 4 or 5 or 6, whether you know it or not, right? If it's golf, it's level of challenge, it's immediate feedback, if you've hit it in the lake or not. You have competition, collaboration, if you're with buddies, right there. There's 6 or 7 things about golf, and I don't really like golf, but there are 6 or 7 things about it that would make me play a game now and again. So think of something that you do, could be a class activity, pass it out and say, right, these 4 things, and then look at the available technology and go, can I accentuate 2 or 3 of those things? And that's it. And then you just iterate, paper prototype, do it at low cost, try it again. I guarantee, from my experience, your students will be appreciative and will give you good feedback, even if it doesn't work perfectly. Because that's what I think students now are so appreciative if you try something different. Great. So it's worth a shot.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, a huge thank you. Honestly, a very sincere thank you for not just today, but I mean, on behalf of myself and many academics who have really got a lot of value out of the research you've done. We've been able to provide more impactful experiences for our students. So a very sincere thank you from both us as academics, but also those students. And lovely to catch up with you as always. And I look forward to us having another session. I think another follow-up one would be good to this. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thanks, Granny, and thanks everyone for listening. And keep in touch. I have my details there. So speak again.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks to everybody for attending. And we will send a recording of the session as well.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye now. Thanks so much.